Amos Jones sat at the corner of a dimly lit bar, nursing his beer as the weight of his troubled life pressed down on him. His fingers clutched the bottle tighter, the cold glass against his skin offering no relief from the heat in his chest. At 38, Amos had weathered many storms, business setbacks, personal losses, and the ever-present strain of daily life. But nothing had prepared him for the quiet unraveling of his marriage to Andrea. The love that once defined their relationship had slowly faded, replaced by a distance that felt impossible to breach. Amos had tried, desperately so, to keep things together. He worked harder, hoped for better moments, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. But deep down, the suspicion had grown louder. Andrea, his wife of over a decade, seemed different. She came home late, avoided eye contact, and there was a coldness between them that was impossible to ignore. As he sat there, trying to drown out the thoughts that had haunted him for months, a man slid onto the stool next to him. His presence was almost magnetic, drawing Amos's attention despite his desire to retreat into his own dark corner. The man was older, perhaps in his mid-50s, but his eyes, dark and piercing, carried an unsettling calm. He didn't speak right away, but the moment he did, his voice was as smooth as the smoke that curled above them from the cigarettes hanging from their lips. "You look like a man who could use some peace," the stranger said, his words quiet but charged with an eerie certainty. Amos glanced at him, unsure whether to engage or ignore him and return to his misery. But there was something about this man, something that made him feel like this moment might not be so random after all. "I'm Justice," the man said, as though that name explained everything. His handshake was firm but oddly comforting. There was a certain depth in his presence, something that made Amos feel like he had stumbled into something far greater than the brief encounter he'd imagined. Was this just another bar conversation? Or was this stranger offering something Amos needed more than he could ever imagine? Amos wasn't sure yet. But as the night stretched on, something inside him started to believe that meeting this man wasn't a coincidence. The weight of his own thoughts began to shift, and he found himself listening more closely than he had to anyone in years. Was this the answer he had been looking for? Could justice offer him the peace, or perhaps the truth he desperately needed? The days following that encounter with justice felt like a blur to Amos. As the nights grew colder and the pressure mounted, he found himself retreating deeper into his own mind. The weight of his emotions felt almost unbearable. His marriage, the one thing he thought would always anchor him, had slowly slipped through his fingers like sand. Amos had always prided himself on being a hard-working man. His career as a mechanic had given him purpose, and his family had been his pride. But recently, all of that seemed to be slipping away, piece by piece. Andrea, his wife, was no longer the woman he'd fallen in love with. She was distant, distracted, and no matter how hard he tried to reach her, the gap between them seemed to grow wider. He didn't know when it had started, but the spark between them had long since dimmed. The constant nagging feeling that something was wrong started to eat at him. He couldn't pinpoint it at first, just small things. Late nights at work, secretive phone calls, the way Andrea's eyes avoided his when they spoke. It wasn't just the silence between them, it was the weight of her absence, the coldness that crept in during moments when they should have been close. The late nights that should have been filled with the warmth of shared moments, of quiet conversations, now felt like a cruel joke. The worst part, however, was the guilt. Amos hated himself for even suspecting Andrea of infidelity. After all, what proof did he have? He had no hard evidence, just a sinking feeling in his gut that was becoming too overwhelming to ignore. But despite the lack of concrete proof, the suspicion lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over him, refusing to go away. The thought of confronting her terrified him. What if he was wrong? What if he tore apart the life they had built over something that was just his imagination running wild? On the other hand, what if he wasn't wrong? What if everything he feared was real? And she had betrayed him in the worst possible way. It wasn't until that conversation with Justice that Amos finally admitted to himself what he'd been trying so desperately to avoid. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. He had to confront the possibility that Andrea wasn't the woman he thought she was, and that their marriage might not survive the truth. In the weeks that followed, the emotional strain on Amos only intensified. His thoughts became more obsessive, more urgent. Every moment with Andrea felt like a facade. Each smile exchanged a lie he didn't know how to uncover. The man he was becoming, a shadow of his former self, was no longer recognizable. His heart ached, not just with the fear of betrayal, but with the profound sense of loss. The life he had built was crumbling, and all he could do was watch, helpless. Amos had never considered himself a man prone to wild imaginings. He was practical, grounded, and above all, loyal to his family. Yet after his conversation with Justice, things started to shift. The stranger's cryptic presence had stirred something inside Amos, a nagging feeling that perhaps the things he had been denying were not just his imagination running wild. As the days passed, he found himself thinking more and more about Justice's words. "You can't ignore what's right in front of you, Amos. Sometimes what you see with your eyes is just the beginning. The truth is deeper than that." Justice's voice echoed in his mind, and the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. Amos began to see things differently. He couldn't ignore the warning signs any longer. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the secrecy that had crept into their lives, there was something off, something Andrea wasn't saying. A sense of dread washed over Amos as he started noticing things he had previously overlooked. Andrea's phone, which she used to leave casually on the kitchen counter, was now always locked, always in her hand, never far from her reach. She became overly cautious about where she went and who she spoke to. She claimed it was just work stress, that her job was demanding more of her time, but deep down, Amos knew it wasn't just that. The real turning point came when he overheard a conversation one evening. Amos had come home early from work, hoping to surprise Andrea with dinner. Instead, he found her in a heated conversation on the phone in the other room. Though he couldn't catch the entire exchange, he heard enough to send chills down his spine. "Roscoe, we can't keep doing this." Andrea's voice was soft, almost pleading. "What if he finds out? I don't want to hurt him, but I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." At the sound of her voice, something inside Amos shattered. Roscoe Jennings. The name was like a slap in the face. Roscoe was someone he had known for years, a good old boy, a former co-worker of Andrea's who had started a business of his own. It never crossed Amos's mind that Roscoe could be more than a casual acquaintance to his wife. But the words, the tone, everything about the conversation was enough to confirm his worst fears. Amos stood frozen, heart racing, as the weight of the truth hit him like a freight train. Andrea was having an affair with Roscoe. His world, his marriage, was a lie. The sense of betrayal was almost unbearable, but in a strange way, it also brought a kind of clarity. For the first time in months, Amos knew exactly what was going on, even if it was the worst possible scenario. It was in that moment, when the world around him seemed to fall apart, that he remembered something Justice had said sometimes: the truth doesn't set you free. It just forces you to face the consequences. Amos wasn't sure what to do next, but the one thing he knew for certain was that everything was about to change. There was no going back from here. Amos had never thought of himself as a man of action, at least not in the way that Justice had suggested. The idea of confronting Andrea's lover, Roscoe Jennings, was beyond his comfort zone. He was a man who preferred to keep the peace, who avoided confrontation whenever possible. But Justice wasn't the kind of man who believed in peacekeeping when the truth needed to be revealed. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot at the bar, Justice looked at Amos with a knowing glance. There was no judgment in his eyes, just a calm certainty that this was the right thing to do. Justice had been quiet for the past few days, letting Amos wrestle with his feelings, but now his words came with a force that Amos couldn't ignore. "You need to confront him," Amos, Justice said, his voice steady and firm. "Roscoe's the one who's been sleeping with your wife. He's the one who's been tearing your life apart. You can't let him walk away from this." Amos flinched at the words. He didn't want to hear them, didn't want to accept that his suspicions were now undeniable facts. But there was something about Justice's calm demeanor, his unwavering confidence, That made Amos feel as if this was the only option left. For months, Amos had felt like a spectator in his own life, helpless to change anything. But Justice's words lit a fire inside him, a sense of empowerment that had been missing for far too long. Confronting him won't change anything, Amos muttered, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they weren't true. What would it change? Maybe nothing. But maybe it would force him to reclaim his dignity, to take control of his life again. You'll never know until you do it, Justice replied, his tone soft but resolute. But I'll be there with you, Amos. I'll make sure you don't go in alone. Amos felt a strange sense of gratitude wash over him. There was something about Justice's presence that made everything seem more manageable. It was as if the weight of the world had been temporarily lifted, and for the first time in a long time, Amos wasn't alone in his suffering. Justice was offering him a path forward, and it wasn't one that would allow him to shy away from the hard truth. That night, as Amos lay in bed, the thought of confronting Roscoe filled him with dread and anticipation in equal measure. He had no idea what would happen when the two men came face to face, but he knew this was the only way forward. The truth had to be revealed, and whatever came after that was something Amos would have to face, no matter how painful it might be. The night of the confrontation had arrived, and Amos felt a pit in his stomach that he couldn't shake. The decision had been made he would confront Roscoe Jennings, the man who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. But no matter how many times he rehearsed what he was going to say, no matter how many different scenarios he played out in his mind, nothing prepared him for what would unfold that evening. The saloon was dimly lit, the worn wooden floors creaking underfoot as the patrons murmured softly, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. Amos stood at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He spotted Roscoe immediately, sitting at a table in the corner, his posture casual, his laugh echoing through the room. To anyone else, Roscoe appeared like just another man enjoying a drink at the end of a long day. But Amos knew better now. This was the man who had shredded his life, who had stolen the one thing that had mattered to him. Justice was by his side, a silent presence that gave Amos the strength to keep moving forward. The plan had been simple: walk up to Roscoe, confront him about the affair, and expose the truth. It wasn't a grand scheme or some elaborate strategy, it was just raw, unfiltered honesty. As they approached the table, Amos's nerves flared. But he didn't stop. Justice was there, a calming influence that made him feel like he wasn't alone. Roscoe looked up when he saw them, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he looked almost resigned, as though he had known this day would come. Amos stopped in front of the table, his fists clenched by his sides. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Roscoe raised an eyebrow, his smug grin slowly fading. "You're gonna stand there all night? Or are you gonna say something?" Roscoe finally broke the silence, his voice dripping with arrogance. Amos's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. He could feel the weight of Justice's gaze on him, urging him to speak the truth. "You and my wife, Roscoe. How long has it been going on?" Amos's voice was steady, but the pain was evident in his eyes. Roscoe's expression shifted, a mix of defiance and guilt crossing his face. "What do you want me to say, Amos? She came to me. She wasn't getting what she needed from you. You've been too busy with your shop to even notice." The words cut deep, but they also sparked something in Amos, a sense of righteous anger that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just hurt anymore. He was angry. Angry at Roscoe. Angry at Andrea. Angry at himself for allowing it all to happen. As the confrontation escalated, words became sharper, accusations more pointed. The tension in the room was palpable. Amos's voice rose as he confronted Roscoe about every lie, every secret. The saloon patrons, sensing the conflict, began to watch, some even murmuring to each other. But then, in a shocking moment, Roscoe stood up, knocking his chair back. His face twisted into a sneer, his voice rising. "You think you're better than me? You think you've got it all figured out? I've been living the life you never had the guts to live. so maybe you should take a look at yourself before pointing fingers." Before Amos could respond, a violent shove sent him stumbling backward. The confrontation that had been simmering for so long finally exploded, and the room erupted into chaos. The emotions boiled over into violence. Punches were thrown, tables overturned, and the air was thick with the sound of fists meeting flesh. But through it all, there was one thing that stood out to Amos: he wasn't fighting for his marriage anymore. He wasn't fighting for Andrea. He was fighting for himself. The fight was brutal, but in the end, it was clear that Amos had won, not through physical violence, but through the strength he had found in himself to confront the truth head-on. Roscoe, beaten and bruised, stumbled out of the saloon, leaving Amos standing there, battered but not broken. The emotional toll had been heavy, but for the first time in a long time, Amos felt a sense of relief. The truth was out. Amos's heart pounded as he stood in the wreckage of the saloon, the taste of victory still bitter on his tongue. He had confronted Roscoe. The truth was out, and the moment of reckoning had come. But even though the physical confrontation had ended, the emotional battle was far from over. Amos knew he couldn't move on until he confronted Andrea, the woman who had shattered the trust he had placed in her. The next morning, the house felt empty, quieter than it had in years. Andrea had been out all night, as she often was lately. She hadn't returned his calls. Amos had no idea where she was or what she was doing, but the anger inside him was growing, gnawing at his insides. When she finally walked through the door, her eyes immediately went to the floor. She didn't speak, but the silence between them was suffocating. The room felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. "Where were you last night?" Amos's voice was tight with anger. Andrea looked up, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and fear. "Amos, Don't you dare give me some excuse," Amos snapped. His hands trembled with rage. "I know about you and Roscoe. I know everything." The words hung in the air, thick and painful. For a long moment, Andrea didn't say anything. Her lips trembled, and her eyes welled up with tears. Amos couldn't tell if she was sorry or if she was simply sorry she'd been caught. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Andrea whispered, her voice barely audible. "But things between us, they've been so strained. You've been so distant, Amos. I felt alone." The explanation hit Amos like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time consumed by his suspicions, so much time trying to figure out where things had gone wrong, that he never truly understood how badly Andrea had been feeling. But that didn't excuse the betrayal. "You've betrayed me," Amos said, his voice trembling with the weight of it all. "You've torn apart everything I thought we had. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Andrea opened her mouth to speak, but before she could respond, a fire ignited in the kitchen. The flames spread quickly, consuming the house with an intensity that felt almost symbolic of their crumbling relationship. Amos's heart raced as the heat filled the room. The very place they had built their life together was burning, much like the love they had once shared. Amos grabbed Andrea's arm, pulling her toward the door. But in that chaotic moment, Andrea broke free, turning back toward the flames. "Amos, I'm sorry," she cried, but it was too late. The flames engulfed her, a symbol of how her recklessness had finally caught up with her actions. Amos stood frozen in the doorway, helpless as the woman he once loved was consumed by the fire. The shock of it all was too much to bear. In that instant, everything changed. Andrea's fate had been sealed, and with it, the last remnants of Amos's old life. As the fire continued to rage behind him, Amos stood in the doorway, his mind reeling with the aftermath of Andrea's tragic fate. The house had become a metaphor for his life, a place that had once been full of warmth and love, now reduced to ashes by betrayal and broken promises. The smoke billowed into the air, the flames licking at the walls of everything he had once known. In that moment, he felt utterly lost, as if the ground beneath him had crumbled to dust. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, justice was there standing beside him, a silent figure in the aftermath. The man who had guided Amos through his darkest days, the one who had given him the strength to confront Roscoe, now seemed even more mysterious than ever. But something was different. Amos couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Justice's presence, something he had missed all along. It wasn't until later, when they were sitting in the remnants of what had been the Jones family home, that the truth finally came to light. "I think it's time you knew the truth," Amos Justice said quietly, his gaze never leaving the flickering remnants of the fire in the distance. "Everything I've told you, everything I've shown you, it's all been leading up to this." Amos looked at Justice, a mixture of confusion and disbelief in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking with exhaustion and grief. Justice hesitated for a moment before finally revealing the truth that had been hidden for so long. "I'm not just some stranger who wandered into your life. I'm Elijah Jones, your grandfather." Amos blinked, unable to comprehend the weight of those words. His grandfather? The man who had been a legend in their family, the one who had passed away years ago, was standing right in front of him, alive, and somehow guiding him through this nightmare. You're my grandfather," Amos repeated, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Justice, or rather—" Elijah nodded slowly. "Yes, Amos. I've been watching over you, guiding you through your trials. I've seen the mistakes you've made, and I've seen the man you could become. I wanted to help you find the strength to make things right, to give you the courage to face the truth." Amos's mind spun, trying to process what he was hearing. All this time, the man who had been offering him advice, pushing him toward confrontation, had been his own flesh and blood. The realization was overwhelming, and it made everything that had happened feel even more surreal. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Amos asked, his voice low and hurt. "Why let me go through all of this alone?" Elijah's gaze softened, his eyes reflecting a mixture of regret and understanding. "Because you had to find your own way, Amos. You had to face your own demons. I couldn't do it for you. But now you understand, now you see the choices you have to make. You're stronger than you think." The shock of the revelation hit Amos like a tidal wave. His grandfather, who he had thought was gone forever, had been the one to guide him all along. He felt both betrayed and strangely comforted by the connection. It was as if the answers had always been in front of him, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when he was ready to see them. As the fire finally began to die down, Amos looked at Elijah, feeling the weight of their shared legacy. The man before him wasn't just a stranger, he was a piece of his family's history, a bridge between the past and the future. And in that moment, Amos understood that the choices he made now would not only affect him, but would ripple through the generations that had come before him and those that would come after. With the house destroyed and the truth laid bare, Amos found himself standing at a crossroads, the aftermath of the past few days weighing heavily on him. The loss of Andrea, the betrayal of Roscoe, and the shocking revelation about his grandfather, all of it had left Amos reeling, emotionally and mentally drained. But as the dust settled, a strange sense of clarity began to take hold. For the first time in years, Amos felt like he could breathe again. The weight of the lies, the secrets, the broken promises, they were all gone. The toxic influences that had been poisoning his life were no longer a part of his reality. The pain was still there, deep in his chest, but there was something freeing about knowing the truth, knowing that, even in the darkest moments, he had made the choice to face it head-on. Amos sat alone on the remnants of what had once been his porch, staring out into the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the landscape. It was a new day, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Amos didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel like he was at the mercy of others. The choices he had made, though difficult, had set him free. Justice, or rather, Elijah had given him the tools to reclaim his life. It wasn't about revenge or anger anymore. It was about finding peace, about moving forward and creating a life that was no longer defined by betrayal. Amos knew it wouldn't be easy. There would still be scars, still be moments of doubt. But the path ahead was his to walk, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his clothes, and took one last look at the remnants of the fire. It was over. The chapter of betrayal and heartbreak had come to an end. And now Amos was ready to write the next chapter of his life, a chapter where he could heal, grow, and most importantly, reclaim his happiness. As he walked away from the ruins of his old life, he could feel a sense of lightness in his step. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Amos wasn't afraid of it. He had faced the truth, he had faced the flames, and he had survived. In the wake of everything that had happened, the fire, the loss of Andrea, and the confrontation with Roscoe, Amos felt a strange combination of exhaustion and relief. His life had been turned upside down, but now that the chaos was beginning to settle, he had a rare moment to breathe, to reflect on what he truly wanted for himself moving forward. For the first time in a long time, Amos found himself waking up without the weight of betrayal pressing down on his chest. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew that he had to rebuild not just his house, but his entire life. The destruction of his home, both physical and emotional, had been the catalyst for this fresh start. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he was no longer afraid to face the unknown. He felt like a man reborn. The first step, he realized, was to reconnect with himself. He had spent so many years lost in the shadows of his marriage, consumed by the anger and hurt from Andrea's betrayal, that he had forgotten who he was beyond the roles of husband and father. He needed to rediscover his own passions, his own identity. He started small. In the mornings, after a long shift at his mechanic shop, he would walk through the woods near his property. The quiet, serene nature of the forest helped him clear his mind and ground himself. Slowly, he began to pick up the pieces of his life, refurbishing his shop, restoring the small things that had once brought him peace. But there was more to healing than physical work. Amos began to reach out to his old friends, those who had known him before he'd become entangled in the mess of his marriage and the lies that had followed. Slowly, he rekindled old connections, ones that reminded him of who he was before everything changed. It wasn't about rushing to forget, it was about learning to live again, learning to thrive in the absence of toxic influences. One of the most unexpected parts of his recovery was the support he received from his family, his parents, distant relatives, and even a few old neighbors who had known him when he was younger. They were there for him in ways that he hadn't anticipated, offering comfort and a sense of belonging that had been missing for so long. And then there was Elijah. Though his grandfather was no longer physically present, Amos continued to feel his influence in the quiet moments, in the decisions he made. Elijah's legacy lived on in him, guiding him to make better choices, to be a stronger man. Amos finally understood the meaning of legacy, not just in terms of family, but in terms of personal strength and growth. He wasn't just rebuilding a life, he was building something greater than he ever had before. As months passed, Amos found himself standing on the precipice of a new chapter. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. They were reminders of how far he had come, how much he had fought to get to this point. The hope that he had once lost, buried under the weight of betrayal and heartbreak, began to return. Amos had come a long way from the man he used to be, the angry, betrayed husband who had been willing to burn everything down to get revenge. The journey of healing and rebuilding had transformed him, but as his life began to stabilize, a new and unexpected challenge arose. His newfound peace was threatened by a powerful temptation, the pull of revenge. It was a cold evening when the message came, a letter sealed with the insignia of Roscoe Jennings's company. At first, Amos didn't want to open it, afraid that whatever was inside would drag him back into the chaos he had fought so hard to leave behind. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he tore it open. Inside was a proposition from Roscoe, one that made Amos's blood run cold. Roscoe, despite the humiliation and defeat he had suffered, was offering Amos a chance for something he had longed for: revenge. He had a plan, one that would ruin everything that Roscoe held dear, and he wanted Amos to join him. The offer was clear: collaborate with Roscoe, and together they could bring down the empire he had built. For a moment, Amos stood frozen. The temptation was real. It was easy to feel the pull of anger and frustration. the desire to make Roscoe pay for everything he had done. He could finally have the justice he felt he deserved, the retribution for the pain that had been inflicted on him and his family. It was a chance to make Roscoe feel the same way Amos had broken, lost, and betrayed. But as quickly as the thought surfaced, it was overshadowed by something stronger. The man he had become over the past months rebuilt, renewed, and strengthened knew better than to be swayed by vengeance. He had learned that revenge was not the answer. It would only lead to more pain, more loss, and more destruction. He wasn't that man anymore. Amos sat down, the letter still in his hands, and took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, but he knew in his heart that the right choice was to move on. To break free from the past, not by seeking revenge, but by embracing redemption. To find peace in knowing that he had taken the high road, even when it seemed like the hardest path. With a steady hand, he tore the letter in half and tossed the pieces into the wind. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. Revenge might have felt sweet in the moment, but redemption, true redemption, was far more powerful. As he walked away from the remnants of the past, Amos understood that this was the ultimate test of his strength. It was no longer about confronting Roscoe or Andrea. It was about confronting himself, his choices, and the man he wanted to become. And in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. What does the future hold for Amos? Will his decision to embrace redemption lead him to the peace he seeks, or will the shadows of his past continue to haunt him? Only time will tell. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter of Amos's journey.